Well, with me here in the studio to discuss this is Mohammed Khalid Alyahya. He's a fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik Hariri Center for the Middle East. And joining us from London is Sayyid Ahmed Alwadaei. He's the Director of Advocacy at the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Sayyid Ahmed Alwadaei, let me begin with you. Nabeel Rajab, his sentence has been upheld. He also faces more charges, could be in jail for a long, long time. Did he receive a fair trial?
Well, I mean, if you just read the 2-year sentence verdict in itself, it's a textbook example of how the Bahraini courts are really suppressing the freedom of expression. And what Nabeel stated, he stated the truth and he exposed the torture in Bahrain, and he was doing his job as a human rights defender. The Bahraini rulers did not like this and they put him in jail. The trial is nothing, but it's simply full of breaches. The United States representatives and a number of other Western states, including the United Kingdom and so on, they did observe the trial, and I think the United States explicitly stated it many times that there is no case and he should be released. That's surprisingly by Bahrain's strongest ally. It's not only by the time when Obama was in power. As a matter of fact, even under the Trump administration, this call was made. So I'm not talking about United Nations. I'm not talking about, any other foreign countries. I'm talking about the strongest allies to Bahrain, right. The United States.
Understood.
And the European Union most recently stated the same.
Okay, so Mohammed Alyahya, in many ways, Bahrain is a progressive country. But here's a guy who disagrees with the government. He tweets a few things and he's banged up in jail for a long, long time. It doesn't sound like a place where you can speak freely or criticize the government at all.
I admit I haven't read the verdict of Nabeel Rajab's case specifically, but I mean, all you have to do is look at the Bahrain inquiry report, the BICI, to look at the list of violations that happened in Bahrain. Bahrain is far from perfect. It has a long way to go in terms of implementing the recommendations that are in the BICI, but what's often ignored is the trans-regional aspect of Iran's equities and militias in the region. There are two...
And I'm going to get to Iran in a second, right? Yeah. But let's just talk about Rajab for a second, because he's speaking about torture, for example. You mentioned the BICI, which was commissioned by the Bahraini government. It was seen as this tremendous development where they're finally turning the mirror on themselves and they're going, okay, maybe we have done something wrong. Human Rights Watch saying the oversight bodies that the government set up in 2012 in response to a recommendation by the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry failed to perform their stated mission of investigating credibly allegations of prison abuse. And here's a guy who says there's torture in this prison. I've been in that prison. I was in that prison. This is what I saw. This is what's happening. And he's facing, beyond the 2 years, 15 years in jail. So that has nothing to do with Iran whatsoever, right?
No, it doesn't.
That might be the climate or the context in the background explaining the paranoia. Is that wrong?
No, like I mentioned, I mean, if you look at the BICI report, it's very detailed in showing a number of violations. But the BICI report also mentions that there's no systematic policy of torture in Bahrain. We can debate now to what extent the Bahraini government has been successful in implementing the BICI. I haven't looked at that in detail. Apparently, there has been an ombudsman created recently to cover these issues. I haven't had the chance to assess to what extent that has succeeded. But the real problem here, and the real problem that is taking away from the efficacy of true defenders of rights and true activists in Bahrain, is that there are organized cells by Iran in that country in the same way that they exist in Iraq and in the same way that exists in Syria. Sarai al-Mukhtar and Sarai al-Ashtar, for example, have just been listed by the United States and the United Kingdom as terrorist entities. Hezbollah is active in Bahrain. There are fighters from Bahrain that have died in Iraq. What people always have to remember and what people fail to consider is that Iran has equities around the region and it reroutes resources. So in any case, removing that influence that Iran has on politics in Bahrain and elsewhere is a necessary step.
Yeah, but how do you remove Iran's influence by throwing people in jail for tweets after they criticized things that the government themselves have said is happening in the country?
It's not just Bahrain. Freedom of speech has lots of room for improvement in the entire region. I'm not a human rights expert, but what I can tell you is a few days ago, the Ministry of Interior in Bahrain released a statement showing that they caught a number of Bahrainis in the country that were involved in a bomb-making facility. They found hard drives. And you know, the problem is some of these recruits are 15 and 16 years old. People implicated in taking up arms.
So is it worth it? Okay, so before I bring you in, Sayyid Ahmed Alwadaei, let me ask you, Mohammed, is it worth it that some innocent people are going to be caught up under human rights abuses because of the Iranian threat?
I don't understand the question.
Because you're saying that, you're telling me, for example, with Nabeel Rajab, well, I haven't really read much, you know, yes, I know it's not great, but the government's argument is that he's connected to this nefarious Iranian stuff.
I don't know.
And if there's no evidence against him, are you suggesting that maybe it's worth it? Some people are going to be caught up because human rights don't really. No, but in the region, it's not great.
What I mentioned is I hadn't read the verdict with Nabeel Rajab. I don't know if it says that he's connected to Iran or if he's not connected to Iran. But take, for example, the case of Abdul Rauf al-Shayeb. Abdul Rauf al-Shayeb was involved in the February 14 movement, and he's in jail in the United Kingdom right now for having sniper manuals and manuals to make IEDs. This was found in his home in London, and he was an asylum seeker in that country. Okay. There are many groups that are equally
involved. So you're making the case.
Bird is one group.
Okay, so you're making the case for Iranian involvement.
No, that is under investigation right now by the Charity Commission in the UK. So, and this is comparable to Iran's activities with the narco trafficking that is a part and parcel of what is doing in Hezbollah.
Okay, so let me bring in Ahmed Alwadaei.
It's something that's international, and that's something that has to be talked about.
Okay, so Sayyid Ahmed Alwadaei. The response from Mohammed is to say Bahrain's under threat from the Iranians, and you have to understand all of this through that prism. Tell me what your response is.
Well, my response is to be the most abusive regimes on earth, and if you just wanted to see where Bahrain is right now, look into the index by, say, all rights groups. Look into Freedom House, for instance, which will describe the country as not a free country. You look into what Reporters Without Borders, when they look into the situation of journalists and how they get kicked out of the country, get imprisoned for tweets and so on. So you talk about one of the most repressive regimes on earth. They've been committing crimes of right, starting from systematic torture, murdering people on the street, killing innocent civilians, executing individuals based on unfair trial, things which United Nations, for instance, would describe as extrajudicial killing. You know, when you look into the context of how Bahrain allowed itself to repress go back in 2011, it was one of the most peaceful movement in the entire Arab world. You talk about almost 50% of the entire nation protested against the ruling family. They are a corrupt ruling family holding the full power, abusing their citizens. And this is what the people stand up for. They stand up for a greater share of the power, democracy, and the rule of law and the human rights. These are the concepts.
Okay, so let me ask Mohammed. Mohammed, do you support the right of ordinary Bahrainis who usually happen to be Shia, might have some sort of affiliation with Iran in the sense that they might like Iran, right? Do you support their right to stand up and protest against their government without getting any operational connections or links from Tehran?
I mean, sure. I mean, but that's not my concern here. I'm somebody who's focused on these networks that are in the region. People calling for their rights, people who have an affinity for one country or another, are different than people that are involved in terrorism and terrorist activities. If you look at Sarai al-Ashtar, for example, they claimed credit for 79 attacks. If you look at Sarai al-Mukhtar, 257 attacks since 2013. These are IEDs. These are people that are being killed in the streets in Bahrain by these groups.
Is it plausible that the government is using this, Sarai al-Mukhtar, as a pretext to clamp down on legitimate dissent? So, for example, Rajab tweets criticizing the Saudi-led war in Yemen that leads him to, or has him ending up in jail.
Is that why he's in jail? Because he criticized the Yemen?
That's part of his charges, yes. That's part of the charges.
I told you, I haven't read the verdict, but if that's part of the charges...
I mean, he's been under scrutiny for a long, long time. Links to Iran from the government, right? For example, okay, come in, Sayyid Ahmed Alwadaei. You can speak more definitively and authoritatively on Nabeel Rajab's case and the context.
Yes, certainly. I could read out some of the tweets which Nabeel tweeted. So just to break down what happened with Nabeel got sentenced to 2 years over what they call it for conducting TV interviews, which he stated Bahrain, the justice system in Bahrain is corrupt and is pretty much controlled by the authorities or by the government. For this reason, Nabeel gets 2-year sentence. Now he is facing additional 15 years imprisonment. 15 years for what the government says, spreading false news during wartime. And precisely they focused on his tweets in relation to the war in Yemen and in relation to exposing torture in Bahrain. For those charges, he's facing up to 15 years imprisonment, and his next trial is due in February. I believe it's on 6th of February. So I just wanted to read out one of the tweets which Nabeel posted on his Twitter, and these are part of the charges. Children have been killed. I'm quoting here. Children have been killed by an airstrike on UN refugee camp in Yemen. And he put a link. And then at least 6 civilians burned to death in further airstrike overturned. A tweet of a link by Amnesty International. A retweet by the UNICEF in relation to the Saudi bombardment in Yemen. And stating the war would bring misery.
So, okay, let me get Mohammed to respond to that. Sorry to interrupt you. So, I mean, that's any normal person on Twitter, right? Is that fair, is my question.
Are these tweets the reason that he's imprisoned?
They're used as part of the prosecution, yes.
Is this I mean, if we can look in the verdict and speak about that, that would make more sense. But again, I'm not going to defend
but again, this is going to be embarrassing for you because
a verdict that I haven't read.
Okay, but again, you knew we were going to talk also about
If it is the case that he tweeted an article and went to prison,
but you knew we were going to talk about
problematic.
This as well. And you sat down and you agreed to this interview as well. So, you know, just sort of claiming, I haven't read the definitive verdict, I haven't read the judge's notes. This is what happened, right? So I'm asking again, it's used usually against the background of, and the arguments have been made by the government, that these are Iranians influenced. Hold on just for a second here, because we have an issue with the Skype connection when you interrupt, right, Ahmed? So the pretext is being used that Rajab and others are being used as Iranian agents. And my question to you again is, all of this might be true that there's Iranian influence in Bahrain, but it doesn't really help their cause if they're throwing people in jail for tweets that criticize the Saudi-led campaign in Yemen, or they're throwing people in jail for criticizing torture. How does that help anyone?
If that is actually the case, then I do agree with you. But there are human rights defenders or people that masqueraded as human rights defenders that are in jail, not in Bahrain, but they're in jail in the United Kingdom, where there are proven, where there's proven evidence of them having spreadsheets on logistics, things like terror financing, things like manuals to create improvised explosive devices. People like Abdul Rauf al-Shaiber, one of these people. If you want to see, these are the Facebook posts from Sarai al-Ashtar that they claim attacks from. One of them is a long-winded condolence letter to Hezbollah after the death of Imad Mughniya.
So then let's get a response from Ahmed. Ahmed, very finally, does it hurt the cause of Nabeel and others who claim to be fighting for legitimate democratic rights that the Iranians have injected themselves into Bahrain?
Look, the context is very simple, and this is what triggered the 2011. It's people, it's part of the Arab Spring, and the Bahrainis had their own chapter in that, and we've seen how much the Saudis, which was the biggest problem, the Saudis, which crashed the democratic movement in 2011. It wasn't the Iranian who marched in the state. The one which continue to be appearing are the most influential when it comes into the crackdown on the Bahraini citizens. I'm talking about systematic torture. This is not a word by the gentleman which you are receiving here. This is the word by the United Nations. In May last year, the Committee Against Torture concluded that there is widespread torture in Bahrain, and they stated that there is a widespread acceptance by the judges in Bahrain to accept torture confessions. There is a problem. Human Rights Watch, when they describe the justice system in the country, they call it a system of injustice, because it's all designed to basically to crash dissents. It's just a political tool the government is using it. My real question is not about, don't talk about Iran as a real context where you have an abusive government that has just unlawfully executed 3 men. I'm talking about an unprecedented level of number of individuals which got their citizenship revoked. I am one of those individuals, which my citizenship got revoked simply because I dared to criticize the king, or I dared to protest against the king. My family has been targeted for this, and that is the real situation. So the real situation is when someone gets arrested, they should have their full rights. If you torture people, if you arrest people and you claim that they are affiliated with Iran, why the hell do you torture them to hell?
Okay.
Why do you torture them and then later on execute them? They have
these are all good points.
And they should have a fair trial, and their human rights must be respected.
These are all strong points. Yeah. And I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.